lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Ware, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Muskogee, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. I saw that part of your acknowledgement statement online states this, that you are obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that the university has played in shaping them. This part here is really powerful. And perhaps during the Q&A, someone can share with me how your university is doing in this regard. I find that these kinds of statements ring hollow if they're not followed by critical reflection, and more vitally, substantive redress that is conceptualized with and by Indigenous communities that have been affected. My talk today is dedicated to the many people who have perished in the face of violence and to those today who endure it. I'd like to start with a poem by Ocean Vuong called Seventh Circle of Earth. It features an epigraph that states, on April 27, 2011, a gay couple, Michael Humphrey and Clayton Capshaw, was murdered by immolation in their home in Dallas, Texas, end quote. The poem. As if my finger tracing your collarbone behind closed doors was enough to erase myself, to forget we built this house knowing it won't last. How does anyone stop regret without cutting off his hands? Another torch streams through the kitchen window. Another errant dove. It's funny, I always knew I'd be warmest beside my man. But don't laugh. Understand me when I say I burn best when crowned with your scent. That earth sweat and old spice I seek out each night. The days refuse me, our faces blackening in the photographs along the wall. Don't laugh. Just tell me the story again of the sparrows who flew from falling Rome, their blazed wings, how ruin nested inside each thimbled throat and made it sing. Until the notes threaded to this, smoke rising from your nostrils. Speak until your voice is nothing but the crackle of charred bones. But don't laugh. When these walls collapse and only sparks, not sparrows, fly out. When they come to sift through these cinders and pluck my tongue, this fisted rose, charcoaled and choked from your gone mouth, each black petal blasted with what's left of our laughter. Laughter ashed to air, to honey, to baby, darling. Look how happy we are to be no one and still American. Thank you for listening to that, because as I talk today about violence, nonviolence, revolution, and justice, I want us to remember how often violence sits in our very bodies, within our minds, in our communities, so very close to home, that sometimes as I speak today and I talk about revolutions around the world, that we ought not forget the quotidian. Violence, I am obsessed with it, so much so that I chose to study it. I grew up seeing a lot of it, some of it more obvious, and for the less obvious, I felt the sting, but lacked the vocabulary to name it, and certainly the analytical skills to interrogate and decode it. Today's meditation on revolution, nonviolence, and education starts at home, intrapersonally. My postulates and my praxis are impelled by Grace Lee Boggs's injunction that we must transform ourselves to transform the world. So that you may better understand why I have chosen this line of study, this topic for today, and why my argumentation is the way it is, I commence with the personal, a useful unit I find for sometimes comprehending the structural, but also to humanize me, to connect us, especially in this virtual space, and also, frankly, to disclose and to be transparent. I try not to be the kind of academic who stands behind objectivism. I do indeed have an agenda. I posit nonviolence as more superior to violence. For my dissertation, I spent 7 months 10 years ago at a secondary school in my home country of Trinidad and Tobago, conducting a vertical case study of school violence, trying to capture multiple layers: the international, the regional, the national, the community level, the classroom, the individual, as well as the historical dimension in which this school was situated. I would sometimes sit there in humid and noisy classrooms, observing, taking field notes, and unexpectedly, my body would register a visceral reaction to bullying, to marginalization, to seeing some students shrinking themselves to fit into the world, hoping to be invisible. My autoethnographic notations thus became both cathartic and revelatory, as they unlocked suppressed memories and fears. And that made way for a deeper and more compassionate engagement with my participants. I was moving toward emotive and spiritual solidarity with them. My past, my childhood, is a site of constant meditation. The journeying backward helps elucidate and dismantle the sometimes bewildering present, so that I could more intentionally try to contour my future. When I disinter the past, I'm able to glimpse discourses and structures tethered to the present in sometimes discontinuous ways, to see how they have created feedback loops and reinforcing systems, whose durability makes them maddeningly resistant to change. You can thus imagine that I am necessarily interested in the question of how do we disrupt these loops and systems toward more just and sustainable futures. I will argue that education for revolutionary nonviolence is a kind of justice in action, a compassionate redress that has the power to resurrect and recreate alternative ontologies as we ponder planetary survival itself. So come with me to my birthplace, Laventille. It sits atop the capital of Trinidad and Tobago, Port of Spain. Trinidad and Tobago are 2 islands, but 1 republic, within a stone's throw of Venezuela. Trinidad, the larger of the 2, was called Irie by indigenous peoples, meaning land of the hummingbird. Anthropologists and archaeologists estimate that indigenous peoples lived in the Caribbean for about 3,000 to 6,000 years prior to the arrival of the infamously daring navigator Christopher Columbus. It was on his 3rd trip to the Caribbean, he took a more southerly route and came upon Irie. He spotted 3 peaks, which reminded him of the Holy Trinity, La Trinidad in Espanol. The name stuck. On display then for the annals of history and for contemporary geopolitics was his power to name something that was already named. His power to erase and reimagine in his own image. His power to use a foreign language to render something else that was foreign and unfamiliar. Grabbed, appraised, owned, tagged, demarcated, put on a map and added to the ferociously expanding catalogue of civilization. Irie vanished, just like much of the population of indigenous peoples, whittled down to whispers and oral histories. And out of its ashes, Trinidad emerged as legible to the outsider. This here, illustrative of how the violence of discourse begets further violences, a feedback loop. Trinidad was handed from the Spanish to the British, settled by the French, who were living on nearby islands, who immigrated along with their African enslaved persons. The Caribbean itself was besieged, among others, by the British, Spanish, Dutch, and French. The Caribbean, with colonialism, slavery, and indentureship, it became a laboratory for that transition from global mercantilism to capitalism, another feedback loop. When slavery ended in about 1834 in Trinidad, about 10 years later, over 300 ships started bringing destitute Indians and Chinese to work as indentured laborers on the former sugar plantations. The explosion in the workforce led to tensions between the now freed African enslaved persons and the newly arrived laborers, who received land as compensation after their indentureship ended. Land, as we know, is the basis upon which to generate wealth. That then deepened the chasm between the newly arrived and the formerly enslaved, which sets the context for today's ethnic tensions across the deeply class-stratified socioeconomic and political topography of Trinidad and Tobago. Gaining its independence in 1962, but not constructing a nation vastly different from the states of the Western mold, Trinidad and Tobago replicated a bureaucratic formation in the post-colonial era that fit the template of the colonial state that was androcentric and patriarchal, heterosexual, able-bodied, and of course, classist. We obtained independence but stayed enslaved to a system that by now was already 500 centuries in the making, a system created by the feedback loop of what Walter Mignolo calls the connection of coloniality and modernity. In fact, he argues that they are different sides of the same coin. Trinidad and Tobago, in other words, was and is not a particularly inclusionary nation state. Laventille, my birthplace, is a socioeconomically depressed community, a community teeming with creativity, which is where the steel pan was created, by the way, but also beset by drugs, gang warfare, high rates of unemployment. I was born and raised there in a 2-room tiny apartment with an outdoor kitchen and toilet. I lived with my ailing grandmother, my mother, who had me at the age of 17 and who by that time had dropped out of school, and my little brother. We all shared one bed until the 1980s hit. Under Ronald Reagan, Helmut Kohl, and Margaret Thatcher, global economic neoliberalism had metastasized and devastating economic contractions followed. Trinidad, with its petrol-based economy, was certainly not immune. A young mother without a high school diploma and 2 young children could not make ends meet in such a global environment. When I was 9 years old and my brother just a year and a half, my mother cobbled together the non-refundable fees and went to the United States Embassy seeking a visa. She sat on a bench under the glistening sun, awaiting her appointment that day to return for a yay or nay from Uncle Sam. She saw the parade of well-heeled applicants being denied visas, and she did what she knew best: ardent prayers. She received an affirmative and that same week had booked a flight bound for the United States. I stood at the airport with my grandmother under the unrelenting Caribbean sun and waved my mother goodbye into the skies. I immediately became the man of the house. My mother sent money monthly, and I would try to budget it for the entire month so that we would not run out of money. I did grocery shopping at the age of 10 and onward. I remember fondly braiding my grandmother's hair, ironing her clothes to take her to her doctor's appointments. Then I would return her home and run back to school. It is all I had: my dear grandmother, school and learning, and books, and determined teachers, and daring dreams. 4 years later, just before my mom would be able to travel to Trinidad and to return to the US with documentation, grandmother passed away from what must have been an untreated malignant tumor. a tumor ignored by a burdened and paltry healthcare system, perhaps further diminished by the global economic downturn. My grandmother passed when I was 14, and I suddenly felt like I had no one else in the world who had my back. I dove further into my education because the bullying, being fatherless, being queer, fearful of violences all around me, I could barely navigate these dissonances on my own. I would either implode or bury half of my own soul. I did the latter and have spent all of my adult life trying to reclaim it. It would take a total of 10 years for my brother and I to come to the United States to meet our mother, whom by then had another son. It is only upon coming here that mother shared with us the details of her distressing chase of the American dream. At times, she had slept on the floor of her friends' apartments, being a nanny, being underpaid, being called racist names, being overworked, the immigrant's tale. And now we were roped in. Me, 20 years old, brothers 13 and 9, and here we were, all four of us, back on one mattress on the floor of a bedroom in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, sharing an apartment with a drug addict, paying rent weekly with hopes that we wouldn't be homeless the following week. Such is the systemic nature of generational poverty. I had now moved from living in a Black and brown majority country to being a racialized minority in the United States. Trinidad does have issues with colorism, but now I had to learn to navigate a racialized environment that could literally end in death. It was here in the United States, in graduate school actually, that I began to historicize my present issues and practice seeing the world as a network of systems. It was at Teachers College I encountered the work of Renisha Bajaj in critical peace education and Peter Coleman, who used this dynamical systems theory to analyze intractable conflicts. I read my favorite book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and therein received the vocabulary and the analytics to decode my childhood and its connection to multiple layers of historical and globalized violences. I wanted to study violence and school violence. And I've continued to study it even a decade later, because I've come to see it as a dynamical system in and of itself, whose archaeology is best analyzed over a long period of time so as to discern patterns. A dynamical system is defined as a set of interconnected elements, for example, beliefs, feelings, and behaviors that change and evolve in time. Dynamical systems theory features what's called attractors, which help explain organized patterns of systemic behavior. Here is a definition of the term attractors. Quote, an attractor is a subset of potential states or patterns of change to which a system's behavior converges over time. Metaphorically, an attractor attracts the system's behavior, so that even very different starting states tend to evolve toward the subset of states defining the attractor. In the absence of an attractor, a system can change and evolve in response to whatever influences and forces it experiences. When a system's dynamics are governed by an attractor, however, the system is resistant to perturbing influences that would otherwise move it to a different state or pattern of changes. An external factor might promote a temporary change in the state of a system, but over time, the system will return to its attractor. End quote. Pretty uplifting, isn't it? Attractors thus help systems maintain themselves because they influence individual and systemic behaviors to cause feedback loops. I therefore characterize the logic of coloniality, which informed obviously colonialism, and today's neoliberalism as an attractor. It seeks to control, exclude, infantilize, label and sort, stigmatize, extract, and all of this entrenches structures of inequity. As Jeremy Rinker argues, quote, inequality cannot be understood as a concept separate from the collective historical traumas of colonialism, imperialism, and marginalization. These collective historical traumas form the bedrock of modern structural institutional violence and are empowered and emboldened by the modern discourses of neoliberal globalization, end quote. And although many feel the sting of these violences, I find that they're often omitted in the scholarship. Through my own research, I've critiqued discursive violence, which is the analytical focus on physical or direct violence when it comes to school violence. Structural violence sanctioned by history and uninterrupted by the state often evades robust interrogation. I won't spend this talk demarcating what is violence. That in of itself is a whole semester. But needless to say, many of us see it and feel the sting from myriad directions. Jackson et al. State quite comprehensively the challenges before us. I quote, "Today, there are a great many severe and often interlinked crises and challenges facing the people of the world. The most serious of these include the well-known disruptions, harms, conflicts, and increased social injustices resulting from rapid human-induced climate change and the exclusions, bleak economic prospects, and discontent caused by increasing levels of wealth inequality and neoliberal economic restructuring. To this can be added ongoing and intensifying forms of violence, direct, structural, cultural, and epistemic, the erosion of human rights and civil liberties as a result of the war on terror and the security technologies of governments, deindustrialization and urban transformations, authoritarian governance, political corruption, and increased levels of racism, prejudice, and xenophobia associated with economic and social exclusion, and the rise of right-wing nationalism and populism, among many others. Directly as a consequence, these interlocking crises are producing social stresses and pressures which contemporary political institutions, for a variety of historical, structural, and governance reasons, are proving largely unable to cope with. States are more frequently resorting to militarized policing forms of disciplinary control and surveillance and repression in response to rising social demands and urban insurrections. Not only have methods of political dissent like protest marches, petitions, and strikes been largely rendered harmless or even co-opted to produce legitimacy to the current system, but politics itself has become largely a matter of the efficient management of people and society in the aims of neoliberal capitalism rather than genuine political contest over competing visions of a good society. There is rising global consciousness that the serious crises the world faces require radical and revolutionary changes to capitalism and the current ways of life, but also that political institutions are really only capable of moderate reforms at best due to their status quo interests, their depoliticization, and their links to corporate elites and neoliberal values. The combination of these factors provides an historical moment of genuine danger and possibility. The danger is that the world could descend into ever greater spirals of violent conflict, chaos, and destruction as these crises intensify and government prove unable to respond effectively or respond with greater efforts at suppression and control. On the other hand, the possibility is that disciplined, strategically informed resistance movements alive with the spirit of radicalism will rise to meet the challenge and instigate revolutionary change, helping to transform our way of life for the betterment of the world environment and people, end quote. So many of us stand with emaciated bodies, minds, and spirits in the face of a tauntingly but unsustainably plenteous modernity. How much more can the planet and its inhabitants endure? Because violence in its many forms undergirds much of the aforementioned, we can't afford to continue investing our energies in the master's tools. The planet and our very survival require the enactment of a revolutionary, justice-oriented non-violence. And to me, an education imbued with this very spirit is part of this enactment. Violence is indeed a master's tool. Listen to the lucid and brilliant voice of Audre Lorde, and let us put down those darn tools. Violence isn't an option because it has created and perpetuates a dynamical system. We need to create positive feedback loops. And we know that nonviolence generally gives us better results. In referencing the amazing and important work of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, in the book Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, I quote Laura Finley, quote, they found that between 1900 and 2006, nonviolent resistance was at least twice as likely to be as successful as were violent campaigns. This was true in even the most dangerous and trying locations, including efforts to topple brutal dictators. They found that violent resistance movements were more inclusive and presented fewer obstacles in terms of moral or physical commitment. Higher levels of participation then increased resilience and commitment and enhanced tactical innovation. Not only were these movements more successful in the short term, but were also found to usher in more durable and peaceful democracies, end quote. If nonviolence and pacifism are so differentially efficacious, then why are they not embraced more? Duane Cady sees three main obstacles reflected in conventional wisdom. One being warism, that is taking war for granted as normal, natural, morally acceptable, and even morally required. Two, pacifism is stereotyped as a moral extreme and absolutely easily dismissed as unrealistic, naive idealism. Three, pacifism is seen to be simply negative, merely anti-war and nothing more. But to me, there are others. According to Laura Finley, intensifying political polarization, an aging social justice movement which is failing to diversify and innovate, an anti-war movement that was divided and self-muzzled during the Obama presidencies, as many felt conflicted regarding whether to protest militarism or to support Obama, which represents to me an apotheosis of what historian Michael Katz calls the institutionalization of dissent. For example, forces like labor unions and many centers where movements used to happen, while being formalized, have also lost their disruptive propensity. Shona McFessel argues that. Another obstacle and challenge to me is, of course, the changing nature of warfare, which has reduced the number and vibrancy of protests. To quote Finley again, quote, instead of mass conscription, which is very public, drones, mercenaries, and missile strikes, far from hidden, constitute a great deal of militaristic activity, end quote. Sean Chabot and Stellan Vithagen thus conceive nonviolence, quote, not just as a strategy without and against violence, but as a holistic and constructive process for making other worlds without, against, and beyond violence possible, end quote. Vithagen sees the potential of nonviolence to become its own dynamical system. So as to make nonviolence truly revolutionary, we have four imperatives before us. One, analytical, to better understand the nature, types and varieties, origins, causes, the potential limitations and consequences of many kinds of violent resistances and non-violent resistances. Two, strategic, we need to understand how resistance can be better organized and implemented. Three, ethical, we need to find goals and ways of acting that will be against all forms of violence and without violence. And fourth, an ecological survival imperative. There exists, according to Richard et al., a short window of opportunity to create the kinds of radical changes to the global economic system and ways of life so as to limit the coming climate crisis. And in some parts of the world, this climate crisis and chaos is already with us. Huh? Here, let me provide a definition of revolutionary nonviolence that is guiding my thinking. Quote, according to Hayward, Revolutionary nonviolence as forms of individual and collective political action directed at fundamentally changing social structures, political subjectivities, modes of power, and ways of being for individuals and communities, as opposed to reformist nonviolence, which is aimed at changing leaders or particular policies, end quote. Revolutionary nonviolence is not just resistance, but it is a way of life. Among younger folk in the social justice movement, there is widespread rejection, according to Sean McFessel, of nonviolence, because for many of the younger folk, quote, nonviolence touches on that disempowerment, that disruptive deficit, and it has come to mean passivity and petitionary politics, where one is petitioning the powerful to recognize our needs rather than forcing the issue through disruption, end quote. McFessel also does note, however, that many of the young folk also do reject armed struggle. This is why I think a revolutionary nonviolence beckons, and why we need to theorize and implement an education for revolutionary nonviolence. According to United States Institute for Peace, despite the three nonviolent methodologies of protest and persuasion, non-cooperation, and intervention, somewhat overlooked is a focus on capacity building, which includes education and training. I will now sketch some values, theorizations, and offer examples of education for revolutionary nonviolence. This isn't exhaustive, but rather an invitation for you to join me hereafter in expanding. This work must be done in and with community. First, it is really an education of and for, preparatory for an envisioned world, but also prefigurative, in that as we dream and sketch, we simultaneously enact, and with the obvious caveat that there'll be infinite course corrections. Iterativity helps us evade stagnation, co-optation and the like. This means, to quote Jackson et al., using forms of radical democracy and equality in decision-making, horizontal forms of relationship, community organizing, new social relations, and political action which embody dignity, equality, and respect for humans, end quote. And I would add, for the entire planet. Similar to critical peace education, which is concerned with analyzing and transforming all forms of violence, education for revolutionary nonviolence should be focused on both content and form, on knowledges, skills, dispositions, and visions. A lopsided focus you see on content without meticulous attention and more than a modicum of fidelity to form merely feeds cynicism, because students perceive it as fancy but hollow rhetoric, the virtue signaling we see so much on vogue in the academy. When I say an education, I really mean educations plural. There is no single formula, for that would be a reinscription of coloniality, right? The opposite of a creative moral imagination, narrowing and malnourished. Education for revolutionary nonviolence at its core must be pluriversal and decolonial, pluriversalizing and decolonizing, epistemically and ontologically. Again, living the credo. This recognizes the multiverse of possibilities and enactments. I didn't spend significant time here to be discussing my past and my deep acquaintance with violence for naught. Education for revolutionary nonviolence begins with self, and not an atomized, Cartesianized self dislocated by enemy, but a self in and with community. If I want to teach others how to limit harm and how to actualize justice, then I must embark on disinterring my past to better understand my wounds and my woundedness, to better help me interrupt the perpetuation of violence. I am in therapy. I am decolonizing my spirituality, walking away, running away from the violent colonial religions that came with the god of guns and plunder, kidnapped my ancestors and left them for dead. I am striving for authenticity and honesty with self, with students, and in varied publics, such as this one today. I want to model healing. Education for revolutionary nonviolence must be healing. Education for revolutionary nonviolence is also centered on abolition. I am only free to the extent that we are all free. And education for revolutionary nonviolence must equip us with the wherewithal to dismantle the carceral and hierarchical state in its many permutations. Abolition is not only about dismantling, but sometimes about delinking from apparatuses of oppression. Let us summon the spirit of the Maroons, those enslaved persons who hurled their chained bodies at their captors in the dank and squalid hulls of slave ships. Those who, when given a moment to get fresh air on the deck of these ships, leapt into the ferocious ocean to die free. Those whose eyes, when first set upon the mountains in the supposed New World, immediately started hatching plots of escape. These Maroons who fled to mountaintops, far from the gaze of white violence and sterilizing denigration, and dared to enact a world on their own terms. Education for revolutionary nonviolence must summon this spirit and energy of the Maroons. And education for revolutionary nonviolence is about pedagogies also of innovation. We need community laboratories everywhere in which we ethically experiment with old and new nonviolent forms of resistance and envisioning. Minds that have been endowed by fear, curiosities slap-wristed, awake. As Mahan and Mahuna instructs, quote, a creative moral imagination must become a heuristic in which we can seek to reach into the network of possibilities in our global ancestral history and sustain innovative possibilities into realizing transformative, restorative, human, and I would add planetary justice. Education for revolutionary nonviolence is justice-oriented. It is concerned with reparations in many forms. Reparations to wounded communities, peoples, and to the planet. When I speak of planetary justice in action, I mean it processually, a restorative approach to listening to and addressing histories of woundedness, but also materially. Without planetary justice, restoration is incomplete. If we don't practice reparations to each other, then we certainly won't know how to grant it to the planet. Sustained nonviolence, in my estimation, is reparations to the planet, because our current violent ways of being are all the damning evidence we need to justify alternatives. Education for revolutionary nonviolence is about pedagogies of cosmic humility and respect for interdependency. Cast rancid, rugged individualism upon the composting heap. Education for revolutionary nonviolence is deeply spiritual. Let us plug in again to our diverse rationalities and spiritualities. Education for revolutionary nonviolence is also about data ethics. How can we use artificial intelligence and social media for peace and justice and for greater good? Education for revolutionary nonviolence is about pedagogies of pleasure activism. Radical hope needs to be fed. To quote Adrienne Marie Brown, let us make justice and liberation the most pleasurable experiences we can have. Let us learn that pleasure gets lost under the weight of oppression, and it is liberatory work to reclaim it. It is important that we stop shaming people for the pleasures that they are able to find in this life. Let us stop equating suffering with a part of how we do justice work, which it feels like how we do now. It's like how you have to be suffering all the time And that's actually not a good long-term survival strategy. Echoing Audre Lorde, we settle for suffering and self-negation because of oppression. Oppression makes us believe that pleasure is not something that we all have equal access to. One of the ways that we start doing the work of reclaiming our full selves, our whole liberated free selves, is by reclaiming our access to pleasure, end quote. And of course, Adrian stresses that this is not pleasure at the expense of others. Education for Revolutionary Nonviolence is about subverting hierarchies and hierarchization. Let me provide some examples of my own prefigurative praxis. I am trying for my research, my scholarship, my activism, and my teaching to reflect this. As regards scholarship, I am co-editing a book with a current student and a former student. The book is called Breaching Hierarchy, Students and Teachers Collaborating for Social Change. It will feature chapters co-written by teachers and students who are working together on social change projects. I wanted to model this, so I invited a student and a former student to be equal partners in this project with me. As regards my research, I have been developing a social change model called Systemic Restorative Praxis in communities such as Laventille, with parents and students. We practice restorative circle training and mediation training together. We use the circles to delve into our past, to understand our present wounds, and to embark on a journey of healing. I then challenge them to teach others the skills as a tool to interrogate the varied violences in their lives and to then dream together of alternative relationalities. I've also received the Spencer Grant and a Fulbright Global Award to spend 15 months across 4 sites, Jamaica, Ghana, Brazil, and Atlanta, Georgia, documenting what I call decolonial peace and justice education. It will be a transatlantic study of 4 Afrocentric youth-based organizations that teach Black youth about their rich Black cultures. I am interested in how Black youth use this political education in their own lives and in their communities. I then plan to put these organizations in conversation with each other to facilitate cross-national solidarity building. This project, impelled by my concern with persistent globalized anti-Blackness, centers asset-based praxis toward Black youth internationalism. As regards my teaching and activism, I have co-created CONAP with students. It stands for Consortium of North American Peace Programs. It has 2 principal aims: to plan an undergraduate student-led conference where students from Canada, United States, and Mexico can convene to share their latest ideas on research and organizing in peace and justice. The pandemic has delayed the 2020 conference, but we're still hoping that one day we'll be able to gather and do it. The conference at its core structure will feature reflection and action in each of the sessions so that they are not just people talking at an audience for 1.5 hours. Sounds familiar? People come into these sessions with questions to engage in a critical dialogue, then spend part of the time discussing how to actualize some of those ideas presented. The other part of CONAP, which just concluded actually last week, was the inaugural Peace and Justice Transformative Leaders Fellowship. Almost 80 undergraduate applicants applied, and we selected 11 students to come to Gettysburg College, all expenses paid, for an intensive week of workshops on how to build and sustain social movements. The fellows will now spend a year implementing and assessing their own social change projects in their communities. Our next iteration of this program will involve high school leaders paired with undergraduates. I co-created and co-implemented this program with a student, Daniel Jones. We want to subvert hierarchies in the very violent space called academe. We want to model an alternative. We are about educating a cadre of young peace and justice leaders. And our charge to them: create new systems, change the world, be the revolution. These are just a few examples of how I am trying to live out an education for revolutionary nonviolence. This is my investment in a planetary justice. I wish to end today with a poem I penned that talks about my relationship with education, relative deprivation, and dreams that refuse to be snuffed out. It's called Defiant, We Make Our Peace. The lights have gone out again. The valley in which I sit, blanketed by a familiar darkness. I blink tears of jealousy at a shining city on a nearby towering hill. I draw my candle nearer with its trembling flicker to warm my aching fingers. I shuffle to the outdoor kitchen, fumbling for some leftovers. I return to my creaking desk. I have homework to finish, but it's getting in the way of my dreams, my growling stomach, my squinting eyes, my blunt pencil. But in the vast darkness, my chest still hums. I shift the homework, both friend and foe, aside, but just for now, and with the blunted stub of my pencil, I dare to sketch some amorphous outline of a dream long deferred. My peripheral view is drawn to some smoke billowing upward from the neighbor's yard. There lives Miss Roberts, my social studies teacher. Through the upward dancing smoke against the star-studded sky, I see the emerging shapes of my ancestors. I see strongly their burdens, their aches, and their brilliant survival. This smoke from my teacher's yard calls out to me. So I walk over to her yard with a strange newfound confidence. I need no lights, for the dirt path there is incandescent with purpose. I peer into her yard, and she is huddled over a drum, with brave fire leaping and singing to the sky. Mrs. Roberts is straining her eyes with glee over a beauteous book. I sit next to her as she reads to me, to us, to the world, and my ears pulse with recognition. She is reading our dreams aloud. The city on a hill quiets itself, listening in. Teacher and I sitting together in a kind of peace I have long yearned for, devouring ancestral knowledge. No one can rip that song from our throats. Together, she and I roar over the now dimmed city and into a world where our right to live with dignity is here and now. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Hakim. I'm here clapping. What a beautiful poem. And thank you so very much for this powerful talk and self-reflection. You made so many salient and necessary points that resonate strongly given the current events of today. You also provided so many pathways to peace and hope. You richly described your personal fieldwork experiences in Laventille, and thank you also for bringing up the experiences that you had in returning back to your fieldwork site to actually conduct the restorative circles with the youth and their parents, and also in other sites as well. Going back to our time in Teachers College and borrowing a page from our experiences in comparative education, what lessons did you learn and practices that you observed that could be borrowed from Laventille and lent to schools here in the US that are struggling with various forms of structural violence that have been intensified by the pandemic? That's my one question, and then I'll turn it over to the multitudes of questions that we have in Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tinini, for that. There are many lessons that I have learned and I'm still learning, right? So I see myself as teacher student, as Frere asks us to be, continually learning along with my students. And so the parents and teachers who I work with and who I am teaching, they're also teaching me. As I think that needs to be a disposition that needs to be taken up. And I'm always so surprised when I see colleagues in the academy who are afraid of embracing this. And I know why they are afraid, because sharing power is scary. I would like to see schools here in the United States of all types, even like Gettysburg College, becoming community centers. Our walls are so large and so tall, and we leave our communities that surround us. And so I would like to see schools across the United States becoming community centers where we are inviting people to come in free of charge to learn myriad kinds of skills, to teach us things in the academy, to teach us how to be better neighbors and partners. That's just one way in which I'm pushing Gettysburg College here to be a better neighbor. But of course, there are many other lessons that I could potentially share. And some, of course, I've already mentioned in the talk here. But I would really love to hear what are some other questions that people have for us today.
That's a wonderful idea. Thank you very much, Dr. Williams. I will now turn this over to Maria Dorofeva, who will take over the Q&A portion of the talk. Thank you very much again.
Well, thank you so much for the talk, Hakim, Professor Williams, and I will begin with the Q&A. We have quite a few questions, so thank you for your patience. Professor Williams, can you please elaborate on the feedback loop nature of the transition of mercantilism to capitalism?
Do we have a whole semester? So growing up in the Caribbean, I didn't learn much about this transition. It's only after leaving the Caribbean, as I mentioned in my talk there, and understanding the history better and being able to step outside of that system, because I think, so Barry Oshry writes about systems blindness, where when you're enmeshed in a particular system, the parochialism of it blocks our view to the larger system and the ways in which it is rendering violence. So being able to leave that system, of course, going back and forth now, I was able to recognize how the Caribbean was really this laboratory, one of many laboratories for the transition from mercantilism to capitalism. And slavery and colonialism certainly provided that. The book, Capitalism and Slavery, written by Trinidad's first Prime Minister, Eric Williams, a book that still bedevils historians and economists today. If you haven't read it, I would encourage you to read it. Of course, in that book, Eric Williams argues that the economic calculus, as opposed to racism, drove slavery, and that racism was a byproduct that was used to entrench the system even further. So certainly not without controversy, his argumentation. But I believe that mercantilism being transitioning to capitalism created its own feedback loop, as Walter McNullo talks about coloniality being linked to modernity. So there isn't any disconnection between those two. Western rationality and the Age of Enlightenment would have us believe that there is indeed a disconnect, that we have left the world of colonialism behind and entered into a new era. This putative new era certainly looks different on the edges, and there are certain structures that look different, but at its core, I believe that it's all part of the same system. And so that to me is a feedback loop of mercantilism, capitalism, colonialism, modernity. It's all linked, it's all the same, and we are trapped within that warp.
Thank you for providing this explanation. Thank you. So our next question is from Anthony Fada. He says that before working in higher education, I worked as a United Methodist pastor. While at Vanderbilt Divinity School, I learned about the idea of decolonizing spirituality. Once I started serving a predominantly white parish, I realized the importance of white people learning how to decolonize their spirituality as well. Do you have any suggestions or thoughts on how white people can begin decolonizing their spirituality and other facets of their lives?
Oh, wow, that's a $1 million question. Mm-hmm. I want to be frank that I have no set perfect answers for decolonizing spirituality, because I myself am still doing it. I am still in therapy. I am still overcoming the trauma of my childhood and my youth. I am still dealing with the intergenerational trauma of religions in the Caribbean foisted upon my peoples. So I am still grappling and working through, because those roots, they are deep, right? And I'm still working on uprooting them. All that as a preface to say, I don't have any ready-made answers on how white folks can do that. I think I'm willing to do this work, and I have been doing it in in community with different ethnicities, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there is a space for that. I also do think it is important for ethnic specific spaces to be outside white supremacist gaze, to do this kind of work as well. So I really don't have any answers on how white folks can decolonize their own spirituality. Certainly a first step I would assume is accounting for the hurt that Western religions rendered upon so many peoples, and then not only acknowledging that hurt, but what does redress look like? Because to me, decolonizing one's spirituality must go hand in hand with redress. And that there's at the core of Freudian praxis, right? So reflection, action, creating a feedback loop, as Paulo Freire argues, going together. So to me, decolonizing one's spirituality for any race probably has an intrapsychic component, an interpersonal component for sure, communal, absolutely. But then not stopping there, absolutely then segueing into redress. Because an education for revolution and violence, as I mentioned, a core part of it must be reparations.
Thank you for the thorough answer to this. I really appreciate it. Our next question is from Professor Colleen Murphy. She's asking if you could speak more about how hope gets fed in ways it needs to be.
One, as I mentioned, is pleasure activism, and I'm trying to take that very seriously. I think, you know, being an immigrant and having to feel like I always have to prove myself, and of course we know in the academy it can be very, very cutthroat and not supportive. I have found comrades and allies who are indeed supportive and who work against, I think, the ways in which the academy entrenches those kinds of violences. So I am trying to not be so serious all the time and so overly ambitious and so always trying to prove myself, because always trying to prove myself it's a capitalist conceit that I'm going to work myself to death. And I need to find more joy in doing this work, because there have been times when I have run myself ragged, where my mental health was so frayed that suicidal ideation was at its peak. And I had to stop and ask myself, if I die, if I wither, if I perish, then what is all that for? And so I have to find joy in my work. I have to find pleasure in the small things, because I do agree with Adrienne Marie Brown that sometimes oppression feels so overwhelming that when you do the justice work, you feel sort of guilty for having any kind of fun. I'm often asking myself, I have so many privileges now, and so now what I do is I'm like, with the guilt, I'm like, I have no time for the guilt. I focus on what can I do with my privileges. And so they go hand in hand, right? Mobilizing my privileges, but also making sure that I find joy in the work. And that joy keeps my hope alive. And I will admit, not every day do I wake up with hope. There are some days where I don't wake up with hope, to be honest with you. But by and large, when I keep my hands and my feet steady in community and with community, that reminds me that many folks without as many privileges as I do have, they're finding ways to have their own joy. They are pressing on. And I want to work in solidarity with them. So therefore, I too must do this work with joy and continue feeding that hope if I want to be alive physically, spiritually, in other kinds of ways, to pursue the visions that I have for myself and this work.
Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you so much for sharing your own personal experience. It's a really interesting approach to work to cultivate this sort of the hope and joy. Thank you for sharing. Our next question is from Teresa Barnes. She's asking, how do the young urban people who are educated in inventing nonviolence fare when confronted by their violent brothers and sisters who are so invested because of social despair in violence?
Right. That is a very good question, right? I want to start by saying and it may have sounded like today I was preaching, but when I am sitting alongside parents and students, I do not preach to them that nonviolence is better than violence. They are living with extreme violences in their community. They know personally that I have pursued a nonviolent path. And I am hoping through the training and the difficult conversations that we have, that they see me modeling that. And part of modeling that nonviolence is not denigrating the ways in which they deal with the violences in their own communities. That they see that I always come with a disposition, a posture of always listening, of compassion, of centering their experiences, as opposed to my vision. My vision cannot be centered in those conversations. Their experiences must be centered. And then it must feed a co-constructed vision. So all that to say, it is a challenge, it is difficult that when I share these skills and I talk about nonviolence, that people say, yeah, what do you do with nonviolence in the face of unrelenting violence? Yeah, that's a big question. And honestly, I tell people, you must do what it takes first and foremost to protect yourselves, to protect your families, to protect your communities. And when I say violence, I mean violence of all kinds, right? Including state violence. And the state ignoring these communities, to me, is a form of state violence. So the direct material violence that people experience in their communities, that's a difficult one. The violence rendered by the state, that one, I have conversations with people and we think about the ways in which we can disrupt, the ways in which they can stop making business proceed as usual. How can they throw a wrench into the system so that the system stops and takes stock of the kind of state violence that's being rendered on those communities? So on the latter, I'm able to give tactics and strategies. The former, when they're experiencing direct violences, material violence in their actual communities, that's more difficult because I'm not living anymore in those communities. So yeah, I want to be honest about that, that there's a distinction there in my approach.
Thank you so much. And this next question actually ties in very nicely to what you've just discussed. And it comes from a student in social work, graduate student. They are asking, how do you emotionally cope with the weight of world violence to people, the planet, and all its inhabitants? How do you find the lightness it requires to still experience life's pleasures?
As I mentioned before, not every day do I wake up with joy. Not every day do I find pleasure in living. But how do I keep going? I keep going when I'm working in community, as I mentioned before. And I think that's really important. I really do think Western rationality leads us to live atomized existences. We're so estranged from each other. Not everyone, but so many, too many. And so once I'm back in community, the energy, it comes at me. I feel it welling up within me. And so that keeps me going. It is indeed heavy. So I'm a vegetarian of 23 years. So I take that rather seriously. To me, it is not only physical choice, but also ethical and spiritual. So that helps me to be light, because I feel as if I'm contributing in my own small way to the world in that regard, of not causing harm, or at least limiting harm in that respect. I try to exercise as often as I can, because I need to keep my body fit. And if the body is not fit, then the other things become foggy and there's too much clutter, and I can't think clearly, and my heart feels heavier. So exercise is important. Trinidad has a wonderful carnival that I used to go to every year. There won't be, because of the pandemic, there wasn't any last year. And so I've been starving in that regard. But carnival is, if any of you know what carnival is, carnival in the Caribbean started as a rejoinder by enslaved persons to what they were seeing in their society. They made a mockery of the French Catholic carnival that was happening then, and they created something new that has become cathartic and vibrant and celebratory. So when I'm there, it feels like a spiritual experience to me, to be dancing in the streets, wearing costumes with my people and people from around the world. So those are just some things that I use to keep my joy. But first and foremost is absolutely continuing to work in community. That one there shows me that I'm not alone. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. And also, just to add, considering the strange times that we're in, you just mentioned the carnival that you can no longer attend because of the pandemic restrictions. And I would just like to add a question from myself. How do you engage with the community? How do you find the emotional strength to do this kind of work without necessarily being able to connect in person?
You broke up on the last part. How do I engage in community?
How do you engage the community? How do you find the emotional strength to do this kind of work without necessarily being able to connect with community members in person because of the pandemic restrictions?
Right. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't like Zoom land. As you can tell, extroverts, I feed off people's energy. So the fact that I can't see your faces and feel your bodies in that room, I starve because of that. And it was very hard for me during the pandemic because I need to be with people. And so that's been a source of spiritual malnourishment for me. But thank God for this. At least we still have something. So I still have parents in Trinidad who ever so often will still will WhatsApp me and say, we're creating this restorative circle training for the fathers in the community. Do you have any ideas? And I will send a voice note, and then they would thank me. And so even if I cannot be there, we're still in community, right? And we're still exchanging ideas, and they're still doing the work there, which is so exciting to me. So that sustains me. So I wake up in the morning and I might feel a bit lethargic and I'm not with people physically, but a question coming from a parent with whom I've been working for the past 5, 6, 7 years, who sends me a message saying, I'm working on a workshop for fathers to teach them restorative circles. Immediately I'm pulled out of my funk because I'm like, hallelujah, spirits, ancestors. Somebody is still doing the work. They are living in the midst of it and they're still doing the work. Who am I not to be happy in this moment? Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. I can speak from experience too that Zoom is very exhausting, and connecting with people in person is something that I miss a lot. And I'm sure all of our audience members right now and everybody at CGS can relate. So thank you. So I would like to conclude, unless there are any additional questions for Professor Williams, with the question from a graduate student in chemical engineering who is working on sustainability research from Vijay Shah. So Vijay is asking, how do I engage those who don't recognize the urgency of issues that are of the links between sustainability, decolonization, and climate, social, environmental justice? And how do I engage people who don't recognize the urgency of these issues, the agency we have to shift the paradigm and to create empathy in engineering spaces where emotional detachment, objectivity, and distance are touted as scientific excellence?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And that's a lot in there, and I'm not sure I'll be able to get to all of it. So I mentioned before during my talk that I try not to stand behind objectivism. No, that's not to say that in doing research I'm not looking out for the ways in which I might be biased, right? That's different. But all of the work I do, my research, my teaching, the ends of which must be in service to others. As Cesar Chavez says, the end of all education must be in service to others. So all of my work, my activism, my research, my teaching, etc., must be in service to other people. I don't have infinite energies. I also have to preserve myself. So I know I cannot do it all. And therefore, of course, you too, Vijay, you can't do it all. I start with where it is generative, where it feeds my soul. And where I have found that is in working with undergraduate students. The examples I gave before, all of those have come out of my being upset with adults and professionals speaking condescendingly to undergraduates, saying, you know, you don't have much experience, you can't contribute to these very thorny issues. And I think it's foolhardy. Our planet is falling apart and we need all ideas right now. And so what gives me joy is to work with a population that has been ignored, condescended upon, and to say, I want to work with you, to learn from you, for you to learn from me, for us to gain skills so that you can go on to do even more amazing work. So, and I think everybody plays a part in this. And I may not be answering your question directly, but if you're being frustrated in that space, I would say, maybe start working with some youth, share your knowledge from the world of engineering and larger STEM fields, which we know has a problem around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Work with some youth, right? Create a pipeline, bring them into that space and teach them about the connection between sustainability and engineering and climate justice, because the youth, they are way ahead of us. They are so excited and they just want more of the language, more of the skills to do this work. And so that's why I work with undergrads, because they are so hungry for this and it makes me hungry too. And so we come together and we're doing magic. And so I would say, start with where you find excitement. Start with where it feeds your soul. And if it doesn't yet exist, create it. These programs did not exist. And this is not to say the work I'm doing here in Gettysburg is all Pollyanna. If you all don't know Gettysburg, Gettysburg was a turning point in the American Civil War. And of course, we're hearing talks about another American Civil War. And I think that there are many lessons we can use from this place here for today's polarized times. So this is a place where people they heard a rumor that Antifa was coming to tear down the monuments on the battlefield. People showed up with lots of guns to protect. This is the place where I live and work. They came with guns to protect statues and monuments. So doing this work is not without fear. There's lots of intimidation, obviously. But day by day, I'm trying to maintain my joy and do the work where I can. I hope some of that is helpful to you, Vijay.
Well, thank you so much for answering this question and for sharing your work and your enthusiasm and inspiration. This is, we certainly appreciate the work that you're doing. Thank you so much. So I would like to pass on the quote unquote the microphone to Donna for the concluding remarks. Again, thank you so much, Professor Williams.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Williams. And just as a personal note, thank you very much, Hakim. Hakim and I are former schoolmates. We went to school together at Teachers College, Columbia University. So it is also a personal joy to invite you in this space. And I really wish we could host you here personally at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. But unfortunately, during the pandemic circumstances, if this is the best that we can get, we will take it. And we definitely hope that we can have you in our space again, because your valuable contributions are evidenced by the wonderful questions that we've been getting from our participants. We had a very high number of participants, so we know that there's a lot of interest in the subject and the topic that you addressed today. So we do hope to welcome you back here in the future. And once again, thank you very much for your talk and your valuable contributions, and also to our audience for all of your incredible questions.
Yes, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for audience members attending and listening. I know you could have been spending your time doing any number of things, so I appreciate that you came today and you asked really wonderful, thought-provoking questions.
All right. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful